The spy who infiltrated Hitler's inner circle. He was American. Nobody knew for 40 years. What you're about to hear is drawn from declassified OSS intelligence files, post-war debriefing transcripts, and the personal accounts of German officials who worked inside the Reich Chancellery between 1942 and 1944, many of whom were later captured by Allied forces and whose testimonies, recorded in Allied custody, contain details that corroborate what one American man was doing inside the most dangerous building in the world, while nobody who loved him knew where he really was. This is a story about the loneliest kind of courage, the kind that cannot be acknowledged, cannot be celebrated, and cannot be explained to the people who are waiting at home wondering why you seem like a stranger when you call. His name was William Harding Hoddick. He worked inside Nazi Germany for 2 years and 4 months. He attended meetings at which decisions were made that killed hundreds of thousands of people. He smiled at men he despised. He shook hands with monsters. He came home in the fall of 1944, went back to his life in Connecticut, and never said a word about any of it for the rest of his natural life. His family found out who he really was in 1989, 4 years after he died, when the CIA declassified his file as part of a review of wartime OSS operations. His daughter Margaret was 61 years old when she read it. She said later that she sat in her kitchen in Hartford for 3 hours after finishing it, not crying, just sitting, trying to reconcile the man she thought she had known with the man in the documents in front of her. She said the hardest part was not the danger. She understood the danger. The hardest part was understanding that he had carried it alone every day for the rest of his life after he came home, and had never once let her see it. That was the job. He did the job completely. William Harding Hoddick was born on September 3, 1909, in New Haven, Connecticut, the only child of German immigrant parents who had arrived in America in 1902 and who had built, over the following decade, a quiet and stable life in a city that welcomed skilled tradespeople and that did not ask too many questions about where you came from as long as you worked hard and kept your affairs in order. His father, Ernst Hoddick, was a watchmaker, a man of extraordinary precision whose entire professional life was organized around the principle that small things done correctly produced large things that functioned reliably, and who passed this principle to his son not through instruction, but through the 10,000 hours of watching that a boy accumulates in his father's workshop over the course of a childhood. His mother, Helene, was from Munich, a woman who had kept the German of her girlhood sharp and alive in the house on Whaley Avenue, cooking German food and reading German books and maintaining the cultural connection to the country she had left with the specific intensity of someone who loves a place and cannot entirely forgive herself for leaving it. William grew up bilingual in a way that went beyond vocabulary and grammar, bilingual in the deeper sense of understanding how Germans thought, what they valued, how they organized their social world, what kinds of behavior produced trust and what kinds produced suspicion. This was not something he studied. It was something he absorbed from his mother the way you absorb everything that happens in your house before you are old enough to choose what to learn. He was a serious student, particularly in languages, and by the time he graduated from Yale in 1931 with a degree in European history, he spoke German, French, and Italian with the fluency that comes from genuine immersion rather than classroom exposure.
He went to work for a trading company in New York that did business with European firms, which gave him reasons to travel to Germany regularly through the 1930s. which meant that when Germany began its transformation into something that required watching carefully, William Hoddick was one of a small number of Americans who had recent and direct knowledge of the country, who spoke the language natively, and who understood the social landscape well enough to move through it without drawing attention. He was recruited by the Office of Strategic Services in the spring of 1942. The OSS was the American Wartime Intelligence Organization created by William Donovan at the direction of President Roosevelt, the predecessor to what would become the CIA, and in 1942, it was a new organization building its operational capacity from scratch and looking urgently for people with exactly the profile that William Hoddick represented. He was 32 years old. He was unmarried at the time of recruitment, though he would marry in 1943, which created a complication that his handler at the OSS noted in the file and that would become one of the central human facts of the next several years. He was physically unremarkable in the precise way that is most useful for the work he was about to do. Medium height, medium build, the kind of face that people remember as pleasant without being able to describe it an hour later. He had no obvious tells, no nervous habits, no physical responses to stress that could betray him in a room where being betrayed meant dying. His training officer at the OSS wrote in his evaluation that Hoddick had the most complete natural composure he had encountered in a recruit, that he appeared to process threat the same way he processed ordinary information, which was calmly and completely and without visible disruption to his surface presentation.
This quality, the evaluation noted, was either the result of an unusually stable psychological constitution or the result of something deeper and harder to name, and that in either case, it made him exceptionally well-suited for extended deep cover operations. His cover identity was Karl Werner Hoffmann, a Swiss-German import and export businessman with offices in Zurich and established business relationships in Berlin going back to the late 1930s, relationships that the OSS had spent 4 months constructing with the thoroughness of people who understood that a cover identity is only as good as the documents and the people that support it, and that either can be tested without warning at any moment. He arrived in Berlin in October of 1942. The city he arrived in was not the Berlin of the 1930s that he had visited on business, the city of cafes and culture and the particular nervous energy of a place that was being remade by a political movement that had not yet fully revealed what it was remaking toward. The Berlin of October 1942 was a city at war, a city that had been bombing and been bombed, a city where the absence of men between 20 and 40 was visible on every street and in every restaurant and on every tram, where the women who ran the shops and the offices and the factories moved with the specific efficient exhaustion of people who had been doing 2 jobs since the men left and who understood that the men were not coming back soon and possibly not at all. The city was also a city of surveillance. The Gestapo was not a metaphor or an abstraction in Berlin in 1942. It was a physical presence, men and women who watched and reported, and whose presence shaped every conversation and every relationship and every public interaction in the city in ways that its residents had adapted to so completely that they no longer consciously registered the adaptation. You did not say certain things. You did not ask certain questions. You did not react to certain information with the expression that the information naturally produced. These were not rules that anyone stated. They were behaviors that the city had learned the way a body learns to protect a wound, automatically and without deliberation. William Hoddick had been trained for this environment. He had been told what it would feel like. He had been given exercises designed to develop the reflexes required to function inside it. None of the training was as useful as the first 3 weeks of actually being there, of walking the streets and eating in the restaurants and conducting the business meetings that his cover required, and learning through direct experience the specific texture of a city that was watching itself. He attended his first meeting at the Reich Chancellery in December of 1942. The meeting was a routine procurement discussion, a gathering of civilian business representatives and mid-level ministry officials to discuss import and export regulations affecting Swiss-German trade. Exactly the kind of meeting that Karl Werner Hoffmann had legitimate reasons to attend, and that provided exactly the kind of access that the OSS needed. Not to military secrets directly, but to the human network of relationships that surrounded military decision-making, the officials and businessmen and functionaries who moved through the corridors of power and who carried information in the things they said and the things they deliberately did not say, and in the specific quality of their anxiety on any given day. Hoddick sat in a conference room in the Reich Chancellery for 2 hours and kept his face completely neutral, and came home to his apartment on Kantstrasse and sat at his desk and wrote, from memory, 23 pages of notes in a code that he and his handler had developed, and that was changed every 3 weeks.
He sent the notes through a dead drop in the Tiergarten Park, a specific loose brick in a wall near the Neuer See, where a German national who was working for the OSS collected them and passed them to a Swiss courier who crossed the border twice a month. He had no way of knowing if the notes reached London. He had no way of knowing if anything he was doing was producing results. That was the nature of the work. You produced the information and you trusted the chain, and you did not ask for confirmation because asking for confirmation was the kind of behavior that drew attention, and drawing attention was the one thing you could not do. He was inside the Reich Chancellery on a regular basis by the spring of 1943, attending meetings that moved up the bureaucratic hierarchy as his cover identity established itself with the credibility that comes from consistent presence and reliable performance of the role. He was introduced to Hermann Goering at a reception in March of 1943. He shook Goering's hand and said the appropriate thing and moved on. He was in a meeting attended by Albert Speer, the Reich Minister of Armaments, in June, a meeting about industrial supply chains that Speer ran with the efficiency of a man who understood production logistics at a level that most of his colleagues did not. And Hoddick sat at the same table as Speer and took his notes and went home and wrote 27 pages. He attended a dinner in September of 1943 at which he was within 20 feet of Adolf Hitler for approximately 4 minutes, close enough to observe the specific physical reality of the man whose decisions were reshaping the world, close enough to hear him speak in the conversational register rather than the public one, and the notes he wrote that night described what he had observed with the precise and affectless language of an intelligence report that was designed to be useful rather than dramatic. He wrote what Hitler looked like up close, how he moved, what his physical health appeared to be, how the people around him behaved in his presence, the specific social dynamics of a room containing a man who held absolute power over everyone in it. These notes were considered among the most valuable human intelligence assessments of Hitler's physical and psychological condition produced during the war. They were read at the highest levels of the OSS and shared with British intelligence. They informed assessments that shaped operational decisions. William Hoddick had no way of knowing any of this. He wrote the notes and put them in the wall in the Tiergarten and went back to being Karl Werner Hoffmann. He married Eleanor Marsh of Hartford, Connecticut in January of 1943 on a brief return to the United States that was officially a business trip,
and that was in fact a combination of operational debriefing and the wedding that he and Eleanor had been planning since before his recruitment, and that could not be postponed without raising questions in Eleanor's family that he was not in a position to answer. He told Eleanor that he was doing intelligence work for the government, which was true, and that he could not tell her more than that, which she accepted with the specific trust of a woman who had decided to marry a man and who understood, in the America of January 1943, that the war was asking things of people that could not always be explained. She did not know he was going back to Berlin. She thought he was working in London. This was not an accident. His handler at the OSS had made the decision deliberately on the grounds that an agent whose wife knew his general location was an agent whose wife could inadvertently reveal his general location, and that Berlin was not a location that could be revealed to anyone without compromising the operation completely. Hoddick accepted this. He went back to Berlin in February of 1943 as Karl Werner Hoffmann, and Eleanor wrote letters to a London address that the OSS maintained and that forwarded them through a process that took 3 to 6 weeks, and that meant that by the time he read her letters, the events they described were already history, and by the time she read his responses, they were equally distant. They were writing to each other across a gap that was not just geographical, but temporal and situational. He in Berlin shaking hands with men whose decisions were killing people. She in Hartford teaching school and waiting for a husband who was not where she thought he was and who could not tell her where he actually was or why. The closest moment came in November of 1943. A Gestapo officer named Hauptsturmführer Dieter Kranz, who worked in the counterintelligence division responsible for monitoring foreign nationals in Berlin, developed a suspicion about Karl Werner Hoffmann that was not based on a specific piece of evidence, but on the professional instinct of a man who had spent years watching people who were not what they said they were, and who recognized in Hoddick a quality of attention that was slightly too comprehensive for a businessman, and a composure that was slightly too consistent for a civilian. Krantz opened a file. He began making inquiries about Hoffmann's Swiss business history, the kind of routine verification that the OSS cover had been designed to withstand, and that it did withstand. But the existence of the inquiry itself was communicated to Hoddick through his contact chain with an urgency that made clear that the situation required a response. The response that Hoddick developed over the next 72 hours was not a plan to flee or to go to ground. It was a plan to meet Dieter Krantz socially, to arrange an introduction through a mutual business acquaintance, to have dinner with the man who was investigating him, and to be, over the course of that dinner, so thoroughly and convincingly Karl Werner Hoffmann, so reliably Swiss and businesslike and uninteresting, that Krantz's professional instinct would be satisfied that the instinct had been wrong. He had dinner with Krantz on a Thursday evening in November of 1943 at a restaurant on Unter den Linden. He ate Sauerbraten and drank 2 glasses of wine and discussed the difficulties of maintaining business relationships across wartime borders for 2 hours with the man who was trying to determine whether he was a spy. He was, by every account, charming and relaxed and completely ordinary. Krantz closed the file in December. He wrote in his notes that Hoffmann was exactly what he appeared to be, a Swiss-German businessman navigating the complications of wartime commerce, and that the initial suspicion had been the result of over-application of professional caution to an innocent subject. He was wrong. He was completely, entirely, fatally wrong, and William Hoddick went home from that dinner and sat in his apartment on Kantstrasse and did not sleep for the rest of the night. Not from fear exactly, but from the specific exhaustion of a man who has been operating at maximum intensity for hours and whose body is releasing the tension that the performance required. He wrote the dinner up in his notes. He described Krantz accurately and completely. He put the notes in the wall in the Tiergarten the next morning. Then he went to a meeting at the Ministry of Economics and was Karl Werner Hoffmann for another 8 hours. He left Berlin in September of 1944 when the operational assessment at the OSS concluded that the advancing Allied forces had made his primary access channels to the Reich Chancellery significantly less productive, and that the risk-to-return calculation had shifted sufficiently that extraction was warranted. He crossed into Switzerland by train as Karl Werner Hoffmann on a Tuesday afternoon, was met by an OSS contact in Zurich, and was debriefed over 4 days in a safe house outside the city before being returned to the United States by a route that took another 2 weeks and that he was not permitted to describe in any document that has been made public. He arrived in Hartford in October of 1944. Eleanor was waiting. She asked him how London had been. He said it had been difficult. She asked if he was all right. He said he was fine. This was the last lie he told her about his wartime service, and it was, in one sense, the largest, because it was the one that covered everything that had come before it, and it was also the one he told every day for the rest of his life by saying nothing, by folding the 2 years and 4 months in Berlin into a silence that he maintained with the same discipline he had brought to the operation itself, because the operation did not end when he came home. The operation ended when he died. He died on March 14th, 1985, of a heart attack in the house in Hartford where he and Eleanor had lived for 40 years. He was 75 years old. Eleanor died in 1987. She never knew. His daughter Margaret found out in 1989 when the CIA sent a letter to the family informing them that William Hoddick's operational file had been declassified and was available for review at the National Archives. Margaret drove to Washington. She spent 2 days in the reading room of the National Archives, going through 460 pages of documents. She read the recruitment assessment that described her father's composure. She read the operational reports from Berlin that described the meetings he attended and the people he met and the information he produced. She read the Krantz dinner report, the 2 hours that her father spent having dinner with a Gestapo officer who was trying to determine if he was a spy, written in her father's precise and affectless intelligence prose. She read the extraction report and the final debriefing summary, which described William Hoddick as one of the most effective deep-cover operatives the OSS had run in continental Europe during the war, and noted that the intelligence he produced had been assessed as contributing materially to several significant Allied operational decisions. She sat in the reading room of the National Archives and held the documents and understood, for the first time, what her father had been. Not the watchful, quiet man who came home from the war and ran a small insurance business in Hartford and coached her brother's Little League team and drove her to piano lessons on Saturday mornings, and who died at 75 with the same composure with which he had apparently done everything else in his life. She understood that man and the man in these documents were the same man, and that the same man had kept an entire other life folded inside him for 40 years, and that she had sat at 1,000 dinners with him and had not seen it, and that he had made sure she would not see it. and that this was the last and most complete thing he had done for her. The protection of not knowing. The gift of a father who seemed ordinary so that she could have an ordinary childhood while he carried what he carried. Here is what William Hoddick's story means in the simplest possible terms. It means that the most important things that happened in the Second World War were not always the things that happened on battlefields. Some of them happened in conference rooms in Berlin, in the things that one quiet man heard and memorized and wrote down and put in a wall in a park. Some of them happened in restaurant booths, in 2 hours of sauerbraten and wine with a Gestapo officer who never knew how close he had come to the truth. Some of them happened in a kitchen in Hartford where a woman sat for 3 hours in 1989 reading about a man she thought she had known completely. The war was fought by men with rifles and men with bombers and men with ships, and it was also fought by men with nothing except a cover identity and a dead drop in a park and the ability to be completely, perfectly, invisibly themselves in a room full of people who would have killed them if they had known who they really were. William Hoddick was one of those men. He did his job so well that nobody knew he had done it for 40 years after the war ended. That is not a failure of recognition. That is the definition of the work. He would have said so himself if he had been the kind of man who talked about it. He was not. He was the kind of man who put the notes in the wall and went to the next meeting and came home and ate dinner and asked his daughter how school had been. That was the job. He did it completely.